where you're going to learn leadership tips designed specifically for non-native speakers. And today we have a topic that might feel obvious, but it is not. So let's take a look at today's topic, breathing. Today, we're going to talk about how breathing impacts your fluency, which means it impacts your presentation skills, your public speaking skills, and ultimately your leadership skills. Because if you are not breathing properly, which I'll show you the 3 ways that you're probably not doing and how to fix it, of course, that's going to impact how people perceive you. And in business, as well as in life, but in particular in business for this lesson, it's what gets people to trust you and respect you. So that's why whenever I start working with clients, of course, everybody wants to elevate their English and focus on more, fancier vocabulary and grammar structure. But the absolute fundamental thing that's going to give you the biggest impact is changing the way that you breathe, optimizing the way that you breathe when you speak English. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, by the way. And before we get started with the breathing lesson, I want to remind you that this is the last week that you can sign up for my Leadership Communication Summer Program. This is basically what I do in my year-long program, condensed to a very intensive 12-week program that's going to absolutely transform the way that you look, feel, and sound when you speak English at work. It's awesome. So make sure to go to tanniasuarez.com/leadership to apply. Okay, so back to breathing. As we said, we're going to go over 3 times. The third one is the hardest. So the first one is to breathe when others speak. This might sound obvious, but as a non-native speaker, what tends to happen is you typically, and a lot of this comes from your beginner to intermediate phase, but because no one points it out, most non-native speakers keep this tendency even in their fluency levels. So what happens is you stop breathing when other people are speaking English because it's your attempt to kind of quiet yourself so that you can listen better. Unfortunately, it has the opposite effect. So this might be something that you did when you were prepping for the Cambridge test or the IELTS and you were trying to listen for the listening portion. However, when you do this, and imagine doing this consistently all day long, if you're listening to English at work for hours per day and you're not breathing well when other people speak, what that does is it increases your anxiety levels. Your heart rate increases because your body doesn't realize from a physiological standpoint that you're just trying to hear better. When you're consistently depriving yourself and holding your breath and making that effort, your body goes into panic mode, fight or flight. So you're holding your breath, your heart rate accelerates. When you're in that physical state, it's really hard to access your creative part of your brain and your language part because those are not survival skills in this context. So what happens is this is when I find a lot of people, a lot of my clients are like, I feel like I constantly freeze when I'm speaking English. I know the right words, but I can't find them when I need them. It really boils down to not just studying more English, it's how you're existing, how you're thinking, and how you're breathing in English. So all I want you to do this week, no judgment, you're just going to observe yourself. You can't fix what you don't know you're doing. So the first step with any of the behavioral changes that I coach is awareness, without shame, without thinking like, oh, I can't believe I've been doing this for so long. No. We're just creating the awareness because that way you're going to fix it even faster. So this week, during all your interactions, and even when you're listening to podcasts or watching a show on Netflix or YouTube, I promise you, like, it's really amazing how much you're holding your breath. So I just want you to observe yourself. Don't try to fix it yet. The first week is just you're in the meeting, you're like, oh, I'm not breathing again. Okay. You're watching a show. Oh, I'm not breathing. You're driving and you're listening to a podcast and you realize like, oh, I was holding my breath again. So just create that sense of awareness. I recommend about a week because that gives you work days. It gives you during your commute, when you're at the gym, it gives you the weekend. So you kind of see if there's a pattern. Are you holding your breath all the time? Or is it more so during certain interactions? And that's going to give you the foundation to know what you're doing to then find the best approach to fix it. Now, the second part, so you're breathing when other people are speaking now. The second moment is to breathe when you speak. Now, this is really interesting because it has to do both with English as well as with your cultural background. So I find that it's a pretty good mix of both that causes well, some non optimal breathing. Okay, so the first reason is when you're a non native speaker, I find that non native speakers tend to, even at the most advanced levels, tend to speak every sentence in one breath. So whether you're reading out loud or you're speaking a thought, it's usually done in one breath. Part of it is because maybe that's how you were training your English back when you were learning it. And again, nobody made you aware that that changes as you become more fluent. The other reason could be that I find it's a combination of breathing through the whole sentence and that maybe in your native language, you're a fast speaker. So if you're a fast speaker in your native language, and this could be culturally from like the country that you're from, or it could be culturally, if we talk more of a micro perspective, it could be your family dynamic. Maybe because I had this happen with a client where we found out, I'm like, okay, you're a really fast speaker, but your English is really good. So let's figure out what's going on here. It wasn't a confidence issue because he was super confident. Um, it actually was because we traced it back to he had grew up with 5 brothers and sisters. And so growing up, if you didn't speak fast, you were not heard. And so it was interesting to see how that impacted his native language and how it bled into his English speaking habits. So that's where you can have fun analyzing. This is what I do with my one-on-one coaching. We figure out, okay, what are the components that are impacting your speed and your delivery? Because at your level, if you're listening to me, you're probably upper intermediate to advanced. It usually goes beyond just the English. So it's about confidence, culture, structure, how you learned English, how you use English. So it's a really interesting thing to break down. Now, in this time to help you here, let's take a look at an example of what I mean with the first example of breathing through the sentence. So, for example, as a non native speaker, let's say you're giving a presentation at work. You might read this sentence all in one breath. And I'll pull it up bigger so you can see it. Okay, I'm going to try to put myself in your shoes. So you might read it as, in today's competitive market, we must continually innovate to stay ahead of the curve and meet evolving consumer demands. Whew. So technically, that is correct English. The pronunciation was clear. Technically, it was correct. But from a natural American speech perspective, it was not natural. It was quite robotic and exhausting. Like, that's just one sentence. If you're giving a 20, 40-minute presentation, goodness, that's where you start building up anxiety. You get anxious before your presentations because you've trained your brain to realize, like, we're about to go and hold our breath for 40 minutes. And so you start feeling more nervous before, during. You might feel, even me just doing that one sentence, like I could feel my heart rate accelerate, my mouth is getting dry. You have all these physiological components that when you feel them, it creates a little bit of panic and it's really hard to speak calmly to deliver the message that you have. And this boils down to how your perception of or how you're perceived as a leader. If you're giving presentations and you look kind of panicky, I know it's because of the English component, but your audience, your team, your executive board, they're going to think it's about you doubting your expertise. And this is why I spend a lot of time coaching breathing, because when you get, as you're advancing in your career, you have to be trusted. You have to be respected, and how you speak plays a big part. Now, let me show you what I mean by, or how you can fix this. So, with American English, this really is a lot about the rhythm and intonation. And so, if you struggle with, you don't know where to emphasize words, or you struggle with American intonation, this is going to help you a lot. Because when you understand natural intonation patterns, that's where you then start learning where to breathe. And I'm going to teach you how to breathe because it's not what you're thinking. It's not inhale, exhale. That's different. That's when you're breathing when other people are speaking. When you're breathing when you're speaking, it changes and it's really cool. Okay, so this is an example taking that same sentence. So in American English, we speak in chunks, not in sentences. So you breathe in between the chunks, the sections, not just every sentence. I would say as a rule of thumb, it's usually every 2 to 5 words, but it's flexible. It depends on how you're speaking and what you're doing. So here what I did is I highlighted the different sections, the chunks of the sentence as I would read it more naturally. I also underlined the words that I would focus on for emphasis. And that's going to help you. Again, it's that perception of your message. Instead of being a robot, you're going to be able to really pull focus and have people pay attention to the parts that you need them to. Now, as you can see for the breathing, I identified 3 places. And again, this is flexible depending on how you're speaking. 3 places where I would recommend breathing. Now, if you're breathing, inhale, exhale, that's not going to sound natural. It's going to feel really obnoxious and annoying to you because that's too long of a pause. And it's going to feel kind of weird for your listener. When you're speaking, when I say breathe, I mean a small inhale only through your mouth, not your nose. It's not going to be, it's just a small, that's it. And you don't have to exhale because the chunk of the sentence that you're reading, that's where your air is getting exhaled. So it's it's probably like a fourth of a second. Whereas if you're breathing, that's a full second. And that really is just not natural. It's not sustainable. You can't do that every 5 words. It's just going to sound ridiculous. Okay, so let's put this into practice. So instead of in today's competitive market, we must continually innovate. That's robot you. Now we're going to inhale. I'm going to do it slowly first. We'll do this 3 times, as we always do. Okay, so you're going to inhale tiny. You know what? Let me make myself bigger. So it's going to go in today's. So notice that when you speak, that's when the air gets out. It also helps when you have good posture. So if you tend to get nervous and get here, this is also going to help you stay in that confident posture more. Okay, so you're going to inhale. Let me make this bigger. In today's competitive market, already, do you see how just by taking that tiny inhale, you don't rush through the words? So then it's really clear. Because when you're at these levels, I find that telling you to slow down, it's ineffective. You know you have to slow down, but you don't. So when you incorporate proper or more optimized breathing, it helps you slow down. But what it really does is it helps you speak clearly. You have more space. So the speed decreases naturally so that you don't feel like you're speaking very slowly and unnaturally. So this is going to make a huge difference in your clarity. All right. So in today's competitive market, and then another little one, we must so it's a tiny inhale because if you inhale too much, then you don't need more air later on. And so it also hurts the fact that if you don't need more air, you're probably not pausing at the chunk and you're going to fall right back into that pattern of reading all the way through. Okay, so tiny inhale through the mouth. In today's competitive market, we must continually innovate. So here, notice that continually was important. So I'm imagining, visualizing I'm in the meeting. I'm trying to encourage them that this is not a one-time thing. We have to, do this continually. Also, when you have words that have longer or multiple syllables, the tendency for a non-native speaker, because you want to sound more fluent, is to rush through those bigger words. When a word has more syllables, you need more space and time. So take your time with those words. Trust that it's still going to sound natural, but they'll be able to understand you. Because when you rush through these multisyllabic words, what happens is there's less clarity. You get a little nervous and it just creates, even if you're like reading off your presentation for some reason or from a document, you start creating the connection that the bigger words are going to cause you a little bit of anxiety. And it's the confidence killers. So instead, we're going to embrace them as confidence builders. So instead of we must continually innovate, we must continually innovate. So take your time with those. It also sounds very confident. When you take your time with those bigger words, it really helps the delivery to be like, oh, like I need to listen to this person. All right. So inhale little. We must continually innovate to stay ahead of the curve. And is really good because you're opening your mouth for the A. So that's going to be a natural part where natural moment where you can do a tiny inhale. And so when you emphasize and, you're going to pronounce the D. So this is more of that advanced pronunciation technique. Usually Americans reduce the D, so it sounds like N. But when you emphasize it, that's where it impacts the pronunciation. All right. So We must continually innovate to stay ahead of the curve and meet evolving consumer demands. Now, that felt like a long time to practice one sentence, but when you take this time to mindfully practice, to really understand and feel like, okay, this is what it feels like with a tiny inhale. Visually, I love doing the sections because you start training yourself to see the intonation and the rhythm. Because a lot of times it's hard to hear it. As a non-native speaker, a lot of times things sound the same to you and you might not hear that nuance. And so I find when you add the visual component, it gives you a lot of clarity. And this is something you can also do um, if you read a book while you're listening to the audiobook, you can kind of play around with this. Maybe highlight or just like put sections in marks whenever you hear as you're listening to the audiobook, you can do that. You can print out an article if that article has the audio, and then you could practice doing that. You don't have to print it out. You can just like however you want to do it. But these are tiny moments where you can see how it feels if you can hear it. And bottom line, look, it's not rocket science, right? Just kind of like break it up somehow. And then you'll, as you're practicing it, when you're reading it 3 times, you'll see where it makes the most sense to chunk it. Okay, great. And now the third thing. Oh, this is where, look, I love my clients. And usually they love me, except for I find that the one day that we focus on this particular exercise that I'm going to teach you, well, it's the one day they probably want to kill me. But it's the day that changes their life. Because when you breathe, just a tiny breath, instead of using fillers, what that does to how you are perceived, how your English is perceived, more importantly, how your conversations are perceived is amazing. So, the way you want to do this, I recommend 2 things. So, it can be visual. If you have someone who can listen to you, I do this with my clients. I'll usually take, let's say this, and you've probably heard me talk about this before. Every time that they're speaking, I don't want to interrupt. You don't want to interrupt yourself because if you have to interrupt and start over, I find that that is even more exhausting. Instead, much like in the first exercise, I believe in building awareness because when you know where the problem is, then you can fix it better. So if you have a partner, or if you're working with me, you want to answer a question in English, and every time you say or just have them raise something. It could just be their hand in front of their face. It could be to lift something. What that does is I find it creates an empathetic approach because you see how distracting the filler is. Because a lot of times you might feel, and I get pushback every time from my clients, and I understand. Look, fillers are not the bad guys, right? Like it's okay to use them every now and then, but overusing them really, really, really kills your conversation. It's incredibly distracting. And you might not realize that because in your mind, you're thinking, I just need a moment to think. And I don't want the other person to constantly hear me pause. But when you see, like when the other person's covering their face or pulling something up, it is amazing when you see just how distracting it can feel. And so I find that when you feel something, when you build that kind of awareness, that's how I get results so much faster than maybe some other approaches because you get it that then it's like, oh, okay, I might need time to think, but this is just not working. So it's going to feel really frustrating at first. So that's one thing if you have somebody that can do that for you. And if not, record yourself. You can record yourself on video or even just audio if you don't feel comfortable looking at yourself. Record yourself answering a question, just a casual, unprepared one. And then what I want you to do is listen to the recording and count. Count how many times you're using those fillers, and because in your mind, you might think, oh, I only did it like 3 times. But when you realize that you actually did it 33 times, it builds that awareness, and that self-awareness is a game changer because then you come at the practice differently. You're like, I want to change this. So it takes away that defensive, like, I need time. So do those 2 things, build that awareness. And then what I want you to do instead of using the filler, do it on your own at first or in a low risk situation, for example, like with a friend, with a coach. And what you want to do is just breathe. It's going to feel like an eternity for you, but just hold it. Let yourself think. As your body realizes it has time to think, it's going to help build that fluidity that impacts your fluency. Once you realize that those pauses, they'll start getting shorter. You'll start feeling more confident. Record yourself again, and then really listen to yourself and think, okay, those pauses, I barely noticed them. This sounds great. Or you might realize, like, oh, you know what? I am pausing a little too much, and it's still killing the flow of it. So you're able to work on that. But I promise you, breathing or just pausing is going to be so much better than saying and all the time. And from a leadership perspective, it just makes it so hard to respect. It really does. It's incredibly distracting. Can you imagine? Okay, if I'm the CEO and you're in a meeting with me and I am trying to tell you, I don't know, something. Okay, so next quarter we need to make some changes because the last quarter's results were not ideal, and there's no way that anybody in that room, number one, does not want to scream in frustration, and number two, they're not going to really, they don't know that it's your English that you're kind of doubting and having those moments and what's breaking up the fluency. They're going to think that you're insecure about your leadership, that you're doubting what you're saying. And so it really doesn't increase respect. It doesn't increase trust. You're like, is that what we should do next quarter? So that's why I focus so much on breath work. That's from the professional perspective. Even in your personal life, if you have a significant other who speaks English, if you have friends who speak English, these are also moments that maybe in the light conversations, you might not see the impact as much, but as you're getting deeper relationships, having a speech pattern that is trustworthy, that is clear, that is smooth, it's going to help you have happy conversations and difficult conversations so much better. So those are three things that you can focus on to increase your fluency, to make sure that your English is optimized. You've worked so hard to have this level of English. You deserve to put out there and be perceived how you know you are on the inside. And I want that for you so much because it makes such a big difference. It opens you up to opportunities, it opens you up to conversations, to relationships, to professional relationships. It opens you up to so much. And most importantly, it makes your day better. You wake up feeling better, your day is better. And ultimately, my goal for you is that your life becomes better. Make sure to sign up for the Leadership Communication Summer Program. This is the last week. It is an intensive 12-week program. You get basically what I do in a year with my clients. We've condensed it to 3 months. It is awesome. So if you need quick results and you want to make sure you get that in before the fall, this is a great program for you. And of course, if you would like to learn more about the 3 essentials of American leadership communication, download this audio training. It's a great way to start understanding the cultural nuances of communication at these higher levels and gives you actionable tips on how you can improve and start getting the ball rolling. Go to tanyasuarez.com/lead. All right, let me look at the comments real quick. All right, so Leo, thank you so much for the question and hello. So you're saying that when you speak English, everything goes well, but out of the blue, you get stuck sometimes. You don't know why. You feel like all the words and phrases just slip my. Yes. So I would encourage you to, going with the theme of today, is to observe yourself. When do you freeze the most? Because maybe, and maybe not, but maybe there's a pattern of when you feel like because right now it feels like out of the blue, you get stuck sometimes. So I would be curious to observe yourself and figure out, is it out of the blue or are there certain triggers? Maybe it's when you speak with native speakers, you feel more nervous. And those are the times when you freeze more. Maybe it's certain topics that you didn't realize. Oh, every time I'm giving a presentation about the Monday meetings and I have to use the future tense to tell my team what to do, that's where you get stuck a little more. So sometimes observing when those moments of freeze happen, if there is a pattern, that makes it a lot easier to approach and find solutions, whether it's breathing more, maybe preparing a little bit more, or building vocabulary for certain topics could be really helpful. Now, the other thing is, while you're finding out if there's a pattern, something that's really interesting for you for those moments, because maybe there isn't a pattern, breathe. I can tell you right now, when you freeze, you are holding your breath. Regardless of whether there's a pattern or a topic or a trigger, the number one thing you can do in those is, and I find sometimes being open about the freeze can help take some pressure off. So instead of just, "Mm, what am I," and just kind of getting physically awkward, I would recommend own it, right? Just breathe. You know what? I'm having a hard time finding the word. I was thinking about, and then describe it in a different way. So when you bring in the people that you're talking to and you let them know what's happening, it actually comes across as really confident. So don't, instead of getting like anxious and worked up, just breathing and just having that moment of like, oh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Um, and then if you don't know how to describe it in a different way, just say, you know what? I'll come back to that later. Moving on to this point. So it takes a really confident person to mess up out loud. And I love that. I think someone who can mess up or forget or have those moments of insecurity, do it out loud and be really smooth and confident about being insecure. That is such a beautiful trait. I think that's where you really like show charisma and confidence. So that could be something that might help you there. Thank you, Leo, for your question. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Gaining fluency is eliminating doubt. Yes. And I would say it's also, you know what, that actually ties into what I just said. I think eliminating doubt is a beautiful thing if that works for you. And Rafael, great for you if it does. If you're the kind of person who that feels like even more pressure, like, oh crap, now I can't doubt anything, then I think another option could be gaining fluency is about, instead of eliminating doubt, I find it's eliminating fear. Because, like I said before, if you're okay with messing up, if you practice like forgetting a word and how would you deal with that situation, I always like to think about the analogy of dancing. Being a good dancer, it doesn't mean that you're perfect. It means that you can dance to any rhythm. You can pivot. You can mess up the step and keep dancing and look graceful and have fun and smile. So I find that when you eliminate the fear of messing up, that's when fluency can really be felt. And it's so much to do about breathing because sometimes it's not a fear of English. Sometimes you don't realize how much holding your breath increases anxiety, which feels like fear. So it's really interesting to see what are the moments that are actually hurting your fluency. And that's the kind of work that I enjoy doing. Thank you, Rafael. Okay, let's see here. We have time for one more. Starlight. Let's see, I'm really insecure about my pronunciation. English teachers have told me pronunciation and accent is not important, but I feel it's affecting my performance. Mm. Okay, when we say that accent is not important, that usually it's more of the argument when people say you have to sound like a native speaker. Well, look, I don't really take issue with it because I get what people mean as someone who has studied other languages. It's I get it, but their intention is good, is my point. However, if you know that it's affecting your performance, then 100% you need to focus more on pronunciation, specifically clarity. So, what I would recommend for you, I have a program. If you want to look into my program for advanced pronunciation, check that out. That's going to help you a lot. The number one thing I would recommend for you is open your mouth more. A lot of times, and if you're getting that feedback from other English teachers, what I think is probably happening is maybe you have correct pronunciation, but it's not clear when you're in a conversational mode. So to me, what that usually means is a person is keeping their mouth really closed. And so you need to, when you're practicing on your own, exaggerate the movements, and then it'll just speak normally in real life. But you need more space, you need more clarity. So the way your mouth moves, it's developing different muscle memory because English is very physical. It's the tongue muscle, it's the cheeks, it's the placement, it's the lips. So I would bet money that if they're saying your pronunciation's good, clarity is what you need to work on. And the step one for that is opening your mouth more. Great questions. Oh, you know what? Let me address this really quick. Let me put this up here. You feel so frustrated when they say it's not important, but then colleagues don't really get me. I know. And I'm sorry that you're feeling that frustration. I know what the English teachers mean when they say that accent doesn't matter, but that's kind of a different conversation, more on like the macro linguistic perspective. For you, because you're what matters, If they avoid talking to you, if they don't really get you, work on it. Find a program that works for you, find YouTube videos that works for you, but really what I need you to do is open your mouth more and identify your high frequency words. Don't study all of English. Focus on what words do you use for work, what words do you use for the small talk conversations that you typically have. Focus on those. Hope that helps. All right, it was so great seeing everyone. Bye.